When I left the orphanage, they said I inherited a sealed foundry. What I built there changed everything. If you've ever stood on a threshold like that, with the whole world and absolutely nothing in front of you at the same time, maybe you'll get this. And if you do, stick around. We tell stories for people who know what it feels like to start from zero. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to be a line item in the state budget. There was no cake, no party, just a cardboard box and a handshake from a man whose name I'd already forgotten. 18 years. 18 years of beige walls, of clothes that were never quite mine, of learning to sleep through the sound of other boys crying in the dark. It all ended not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a closing office door. I stood in the hallway of the St. Jude's Home for Boys, the place that had been my entire world, and felt nothing. Not freedom, not fear, just a strange, hollow echo where a feeling was supposed to be. My release papers were in my pocket, a flimsy shield against the world. The box in my hands contained every possession I had: 3 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book about stars, and a small, surprisingly heavy manila envelope that had been given to me by Ms. Albright, my caseworker for the final 2 years. She was a woman built of straight lines and sensible shoes, her face a permanent mask of weary pragmatism. She'd sat me down in her sterile office, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and old paper, and slid the envelope across the desk. "Leo," she'd said, her voice flat, "this is it, the end of the line for us." I'd nodded, watching a water stain on the ceiling tile that looked vaguely like a sad dog. "You have your transitional stipend, $250. It's not much, but it's the law. Your bus ticket to the city shelter is in there. You check in by 6 p.m. I nodded again. This was the speech she gave to all of us, the one that said, "You are an adult now. You are on your own. Do not fail in a way that creates more paperwork for me." But then she'd pushed the heavier envelope forward. It was sealed with brittle, yellowed tape. My name, Leo Sterling, was written on the front in a shaky, unfamiliar cursive. "This also came into our possession," she said, tapping it with a single, unpainted fingernail. "It's from your grandfather's estate, or what's left of it." My grandfather. The words felt foreign. I had only fleeting, dreamlike memories of him, the smell of sawdust and pipe tobacco, a deep laugh that seemed to shake the floor, the rough warmth of a calloused hand holding mine. He'd vanished from my life when I was 4, the same year my parents died in a car crash on a slick winter road. The official story was that he couldn't cope, that he'd signed over his rights and disappeared, abandoned me. It was a simple, clean narrative, the kind the system prefers. "His estate?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Ms. Albright gave a short, mirthless huff. "Don't get your hopes up. It's not a mansion in the Hamptons. According to the state records, he left you a single property, a defunct foundry in a town called Oakhaven. It's been sitting vacant for 14 years. She slid a second document out from a folder. It was a tax delinquency notice. The number on the bottom line had a lot of zeros. "He also left you this," she said, dropping a single, ornate iron key on the table. It was heavy, complex, and black with age. It looked like it belonged to a castle, not a derelict building. "The property has issues. Significant back taxes are owed, over $50,000. The town of Oakhaven has a lien on it. As the sole heir, the debt is now, technically, your problem." My problem. At 17 years and 364 days old, my biggest problem was trying to get an extra serving of mashed potatoes at dinner. Now I owed a town I'd never heard of more money than I could possibly imagine. "So what does that mean?" I asked, the hollow feeling in my chest starting to fill with a cold dread. "It means you have a choice," she said, leaning back, her duty almost done. "The land has some value. A development group has made a standing offer to the town to buy it for the value of the debt. You can sign over the deed to them, they'll pay the taxes, and their lawyers say they'll give you a courtesy payment of $5,000. You walk away free and clear with enough to get a real start. Or," she paused, letting the weight of the alternative settle, "you do nothing. The town forecloses in 90 days, you get nothing, and the developers buy it at auction anyway. My advice? Take the money, Leo. Sign the papers. Don't get attached to a pile of rust you've never seen." $5,000. It felt like a winning lottery ticket. It was a security deposit on an apartment. It was months of not having to sleep in a shelter. It was the smart choice, the only choice. I looked at the key on the table. It didn't look like a key to a problem. It looked like a key to a story. "Where is this place?" I asked. She sighed, the sound of 1,000 similar conversations with 1,000 other hopeful, foolish boys. "Oakhaven. It's about a 4-hour bus ride upstate. It's not much of a town anymore. The kind of place people leave, not go to." She pushed a pen and a form across the table. "Just sign here. I can have the check wired to your new account by tomorrow." I stared at the signature line. My hand should have been reaching for the pen. My brain was screaming at me to take the deal. It was a clean break, a fresh start. But my eyes kept drifting to the heavy iron key and the envelope with my name on it. He wrote my name. The man who abandoned me had, at some point, sat down and written my name. I picked up the key. It was cold and solid in my palm. "I want to see it first," I said. The words surprised me as much as they did her. Ms. Albright's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Pity, maybe, or just exasperation. "The bus to Oakhaven leaves from the same terminal. It goes in the other direction," she said. "The choice is yours, Leo, but the world doesn't wait for boys to make up their minds." I stood up, clutching the box and the key. "I know," I said. And with that, I walked out of her office, down the long, echoing hall, and pushed open the heavy front doors of St. Jude's for the last time. The city air hit me, damp and smelling of exhaust and rain. It was the first breath of my new life, and it tasted like fear. The bus station was a cathedral of human misery. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, wet wool, and desperation. Every face looked tired, etched with the story of a long journey just ended, or a difficult one about to begin. I found the ticket counter for the upstate routes, a lonely little booth at the far end of the terminal. The woman behind the glass had a face like a crumpled paper bag and a voice that sounded like gravel in a blender. "Oakhaven?" she rasped, looking at me over her glasses. "Nobody's bought a ticket to Oakhaven in a month. You sure, kid?" I slid a 20 from my precious stipend under the glass. "I'm sure." The bus was an old, rattling machine that groaned and sighed its way out of the city, leaving the towering skyline behind for the flat, gray expanse of the suburbs, and then, finally, the rolling, empty hills of the countryside. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window and watched the world blur by. For 18 years, my world had been a single building. Now it was expanding by 60 miles an hour. I felt like an astronaut on a spacewalk, untethered and spinning into a vast, indifferent void. The $230 left in my pocket felt impossibly small. I had no plan, no friends to call, No family to fall back on. Just a key to a pile of rust and a $50,000 debt in a town I couldn't find on a map. Ms. Albright's voice echoed in my head. "Take the money, Leo. Don't get attached." She was right, of course. It was the sensible thing to do, the smart play. But something in me, a stubborn, foolish cinder of curiosity that the system hadn't managed to extinguish, needed to see it. I needed to stand in the place my grandfather had left behind and understand why. Why he'd kept it. Why he'd left it to the grandson he'd supposedly thrown away. The journey stretched on. The landscape grew more desolate. The towns we passed through were smaller, the paint on the houses more peeled, the closed-down storefronts more frequent. This was the other America, the one that got left behind when the factories closed and the highways rerouted. This was a land of forgotten places. After 4 hours that felt like a lifetime, the bus driver called out, "Oak Haven, this is it, kid. End of the line." I was the only one who got off. The bus stop was just a rusty sign on the side of a 2-lane road. There was no station, no shelter, just the sign and a cracked patch of asphalt. The bus pulled away with a hydraulic hiss, its red taillights shrinking in the twilight until they were gone, leaving me in a profound and unnerving silence. The air was different here. It was clean and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. Oak Haven wasn't much. A single main street with a blinking yellow traffic light, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a gas station, a post office, and a handful of other buildings, most of them dark. It was a town holding its breath, waiting for a reason to either wake up or give up completely. I asked the tired-looking woman at the gas station where the old Sterling Foundry was. She gave me a long look, wiping her hands on an oily rag. "Sterling Foundry? Hasn't been anyone out there in years. It's a mile down the old mill road. Can't miss it. Big ugly thing on the river. You family?" The question caught me off guard. "Sort of," I mumbled, and she just nodded, her eyes holding a story I didn't know how to ask for. I walked. The sun was setting, painting the bruised purple clouds in shades of orange and pink. The road was lined with skeletal trees, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers into the sky. It was beautiful and lonely, and with every step, the feeling of being an intruder grew stronger. And then I saw it. It rose up out of the landscape like the carcass of some great metal beast. A collection of vast, corrugated steel buildings, streaked with decades of rust that looked like dried blood in the fading light. The windows were dark, shattered eyes. A tall brick smokestack stood like a tombstone against the sky. The whole place was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, but the gate, secured by a heavy, rusted chain, was ajar. A sign, so faded it was almost illegible, hung crookedly. "Sterling & Son, Forged Metals." I slipped through the gate. The ground crunched under my worn sneakers. The scale of the place was overwhelming. It was a monument to a dead industry. I walked the perimeter, my hand trailing along the cold, rough metal of the walls. It felt like touching a dinosaur. I could almost hear the ghosts of the machines, the roar of the furnaces, the shouts of men. This was his, my grandfather's. What had happened here? I found the main entrance, a set of sliding doors big enough to drive a truck through. They were padlocked and chained, immovable. I remembered Ms. Albright's words, sealed. This place wasn't just closed, it was entombed. Doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp. This was a mistake. I had traded $5,000 for a front-row seat to my own failure. I should have taken the money. I should have signed the paper. I was about to turn back, to walk the mile back to town and figure out how to get a bus ticket to anywhere else, when I saw it. To the side of the main doors, almost hidden by an overgrown thicket of weeds, was a smaller, man-sized door. It was made of thick steel, painted the same faded red as the rest of the building, and in the center of it was a keyhole. Not a modern lock, but a large, old-fashioned one. My hand went to my pocket. I pulled out the iron key. It felt heavy, ancient. I slid it into the lock. It was a perfect fit. With a grating squeal of metal on metal that sounded like a scream, the lock turned. I held my breath, put my shoulder to the door, and pushed. It resisted, groaning in protest, then swung inward into a gulf of absolute darkness. The air that rolled out of the foundry was thick and cold, carrying a smell I couldn't place, a mix of cold iron, engine oil, and something else. Time. It smelled like a sealed tomb. I stood at the threshold for a long moment, the last of the evening light at my back, peering into an abyss. My phone's flashlight was a weak, pathetic beam against the sheer scale of the darkness inside. I took a step, and then another, the heavy door swinging shut behind me with a deep, resonant boom that echoed through the cavernous space. The sound of it closing sealed me in, and a jolt of pure panic shot through me. I was 18 years old, alone, in a locked building in a forgotten town, with less than $200 to my name. Every rational thought screamed at me to open the door and run, but the key in my pocket felt like an anchor. This was my history, my mystery. I had to know. I swept the flashlight beam across the space. The foundry floor was immense, a vast concrete plain littered with the hulking silhouettes of machinery. Lathes, presses, forges, all of them silent, shrouded in thick canvas tarps that were gray with a decade and a half of dust. They looked like sleeping giants. Catwalks crisscrossed the high ceiling far above, lost in the gloom. It was a cathedral of work, abandoned by its gods. My light caught something on the wall, a row of old metal lockers, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen mid-sentence. Further on, a time clock station, with a rack full of punch cards, still waiting for workers who would never return. I moved deeper into the building, my footsteps the only sound, echoing in the profound silence. Dust motes danced in my flashlight beam like tiny, frantic ghosts. I felt like an archaeologist discovering a lost city. Everything was just as it had been left, a perfect snapshot of the last day this place had breathed. The last day my grandfather had been here. I was looking for an office, a place where the heart of the business would have been. I found a set of narrow metal stairs leading up to a glass-enclosed room that overlooked the main floor. The glass was grimy, but I could make out the shape of a desk inside. This was it. The door at the top of the stairs was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The office was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. A large metal desk dominated the space, its surface coated in a thick, undisturbed blanket of dust. There was a chair, a filing cabinet, and a calendar on the wall, its pages still turned to August, 14 years ago. The air was stale, motionless. I ran my finger across the desk, leaving a clean streak in the grime. This was his space. He had sat in this chair, looked out this window. He had touched these things. It was the closest I had been to him in my entire life. I tried the desk drawers. They were all unlocked. I pulled them open one by one. They were filled with the mundane artifacts of a business. Invoices, order forms, pens that had long since dried up, paper clips furred with rust. Nothing personal, nothing that told me anything about the man. The filing cabinet was the same, More business records, tax forms, supplier catalogs. I was about to give up, the cold feeling of disappointment settling in again, when my light caught something on the corner of the desk, almost hidden behind an old, unplugged desk lamp. It was a small, gray metal box, like a cash box or a tackle box. It wasn't covered in the same thick layer of dust as everything else. It had been wiped clean, relatively recently. It had a simple lock on the front. I jiggled it, but it was secure. Hope, sharp and painful, flared in my chest. I looked around the office for something to pry it open with. I found a heavy-duty letter opener in one of the drawers. I wedged the tip into the seam near the lock and pushed. The metal groaned. I put all my weight into it, my knuckles white. With a sharp crack, the lock gave way. I lifted the lid. My breath caught in my throat. Inside, there was no money, no treasure. There were two things. The first was a stack of letters, tied with a simple piece of twine. They were addressed to me, Leo Sterling. The second was a small, handheld cassette recorder, the kind journalists used in the 90s, in a neat row of half a dozen microcassette tapes, each labeled with a date. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I sank into the dusty chair, the chair my grandfather had sat in, and stared at the contents of the box. This was it. This was the story. I picked up the cassette player. It felt impossibly light. My hands were trembling as I checked the battery compartment. It was empty. Of course. For a frantic moment, I thought it was over, that the story would remain locked away. Then I remembered the gas station. It was a mile back, but it felt like 100. I didn't care. I grabbed the cassette player and the box and almost ran out of the Foundry, the heavy door booming shut behind me again. The walk back to town was a blur. The gas station was still open, its fluorescent lights an oasis in the dark. The woman at the counter looked up, unsurprised as I stumbled in, breathless. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I need batteries," I panted, placing the cassette player on the counter. "AA." She looked at the old device, then back at my face. A flicker of something soft, maybe memory, crossed her features. "He used to have one just like that," she said quietly. "Your grandfather, always talking into it." She sold me the batteries and a bottle of water and a pre-packaged sandwich that tasted like cardboard and regret. I paid, my hands still shaking, and walked back to the Foundry under a sky now filled with 1,000,000 brilliant stars, more than I had ever seen in the city. Back in the office, under the single steady beam of my phone's flashlight, I loaded the batteries into the cassette player. I picked up the first tape, the one with the earliest date, and slid it into the machine. I took a deep breath, and I pressed play. A hiss of static filled the small office, a sound from a forgotten time. Then a click and a voice. A voice that was deep and rough, like gravel, but with a warmth that seemed to reach across the years and touch me. It was a voice I knew, buried deep in the oldest, most faded corner of my memory. "Leo," the voice said, and my heart seized in my chest. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for so many things. Most of all, I'm sorry I had to leave you." The voice on the tape paused, and I could hear the sound of a heavy sigh, the scrape of a chair. "They'll tell you I abandoned you, that I couldn't handle it after your folks, after the accident. It's a lie, but it's a lie that kept you safe." I sat frozen in the dusty chair, the small plastic device in my hands, feeling like the most important object in the world. The Foundry, the debt, the $5,000. It all faded away. There was only this voice, pulling me back through time. This foundry, he continued, his voice heavy with a weariness that was more than just physical. It was my life, my father's life before me. Sterling and Son. We built things here, good, solid things. But the world changed. The big mills overseas could do it cheaper. The orders dried up. I was proud, Leo, too proud to admit I was failing. He described the slow, painful death of the business, the layoffs, the bank notices, the creeping despair that had settled over the town as its industrial heart stopped beating. He spoke of his desperation, the sleepless nights spent staring at the numbers, trying to find a way out that didn't exist. Then they came, he said, and the warmth in his voice was replaced by a hard, cold edge. A man named Silas Croft. He was a local boy who'd gone to the city and come back with sharp suits and sharper friends. He said he could help. He had associates who needed a place to store things, a place with big doors and not a lot of questions. The story poured out of the tiny speaker, a confession whispered into the dark. My grandfather, a good man backed into a corner, had made a deal. He let Croft's crew use the Foundry's back warehouses at night. In exchange, he got envelopes of cash, enough to keep the lights on, to make payroll for the few guys he had left. He told himself it was temporary, a compromise. He told himself he wasn't really a part of it. But you're always a part of it, my grandfather's voice rasped. At first, it was just stolen goods, car parts, electronics. Then it got heavier. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know, but I knew. You always know. He was laundering their money through the Foundry's books, a ghost business operating in the shadow of the real one. For a while, it worked. The Foundry stayed open. He could breathe. But the deal had a price, and it was his soul. The day your parents died, it changed everything. Suddenly, there was you, this perfect little 4-year-old boy with the whole world ahead of him. And I was looking at my life, at the compromises I'd made, and I felt so dirty. I knew I had to get out. For you. He told Croft he was done. He was going to shut the Foundry down, sell it, and raise me far away from all of this. Croft had just smiled, a cold, thin smile. He explained that getting out wasn't an option. My grandfather wasn't a partner. He was an asset, and they weren't going to let him go. He threatened you, Leo. The voice on the tape cracked, thick with an anguish that was still raw after all these years. He said if I ever went to the cops, if I ever tried to run, they would make it look like another accident. They would take you. I looked at you sleeping in your little bed, and I knew I couldn't risk it. I couldn't. So he devised a plan, a desperate, crazy plan. He started skimming from them, small amounts at first, hiding cash. He began documenting everything, names, dates, shipments. He created his own insurance policy. Then he set his plan in motion. He told Croft he was having a nervous breakdown, that he couldn't handle the grief. He started acting erratically. He told everyone he was a danger to me, that I needed to be somewhere safe. He made the hardest decision of his life. He called Child Protective Services on himself. I had to make them believe I was abandoning you, he whispered, his voice choked with sobs. I had to push you away to save you. It was the only way they'd leave you alone. If I was gone, if the Foundry was sealed, if I vanished from the face of the earth, they'd have no leverage over me, and you would be safe, lost in the system where they couldn't find you. The last tape was dated just a few days after he'd left me at St. Jude's. His voice was different, resigned. "I'm going away now, Leo. I've given my evidence to a man I trust, a federal agent. He's arranged a new life for me, a new name. Part of the deal is I can never contact you. Never. It's the only way to be sure. I sealed the Foundry. I left it in your name, a trust that would activate on your 18th birthday. It's all I have to give you. A pile of rust and a story." The tape ended. The hiss of static returned. The silence in the office was deafening. I sat there for I don't know how long, tears streaming down my face, dripping from my chin onto the dusty desk. I cried for the 4-year-old boy who thought his grandfather had left him. I cried for the man who had to tear his own heart out to save his grandson. He hadn't abandoned me. He had protected me. It was a sacrifice, not a betrayal. The entire narrative of my life, the simple, cruel story of being unwanted, had just been obliterated. I was not an orphan because I was unloved. I was an orphan because I was loved so much that a man had been willing to destroy his own life to ensure I would have one. The weight of that love, that sacrifice, was crushing and beautiful all at once. I wiped my eyes and picked up the stack of letters. I untied the twine. The top letter was shorter than the others. "Leo," it began, in the same shaky cursive as the envelope. "The tapes told you why. This letter is about what's next. It's about your choice." My choice. The word echoed Ms. Albright's. "The debt on this place is real, the $50,000. But the development group trying to buy it, that's not a coincidence. It's run by a subsidiary of a company owned by Silas Croft's son. They've been waiting for years, patiently, for this place to fall into their hands. They want to bury what happened here under a parking lot and a shopping mall. They want to erase the story." I read on, my heart pounding. "You can let them. You can sign the papers, take their blood money, and walk away. No one would blame you. It's the easy path. Or you can fight. But you can't fight with nothing." He explained that the money he'd skimmed, the dirty money he'd hidden away, was still here. He gave me instructions, simple and clear. "In this office, under the 3rd floorboard from the window, there's a box. Inside is $60,000. It's enough to pay the back taxes and have a little left over to live on while you figure things out. It's not clean money, son. It's the devil's own currency. But maybe, just maybe, you can use it to do something good. To save this place. To build something new from the wreckage of my mistakes." The letter ended with a final, heartbreaking plea. "Whatever you choose, know this. I loved you. I never stopped. Live a good life, Leo. Be a better man than I was. Your grandfather, Arthur Sterling." I put the letter down, my hands trembling. I looked at the floorboards. The 3rd one from the window. It looked just like all the others. I used the letter opener again, wedging it into the crack. The board creaked and lifted, and there, nestled in the dark space beneath, was a metal box. I lifted it out. It was heavy. I opened it. It was full of cash. Bundles of $100 bills wrapped in rubber bands. $60,000. The solution to all my problems, and the beginning of a whole new one. I spent the night in the office, sleeping on the floor with my jacket as a pillow. Sleep didn't come easy. The voice from the tapes and the words from the letters chased each other around my mind. I was no longer just Leo the orphan. I was Leo Sterling, the heir to a legacy of sacrifice and secrets, sitting on a pile of dirty money with an impossible choice to make. The logical part of my brain, the part that had been conditioned by 18 years of institutional survival, was screaming at me. Take the money and run. All of it. Don't pay the taxes. Just take the 60,000 and disappear. Start a new life somewhere else. Who would ever know? It was a fortune. It was more than a fresh start. It was a head start. I could go to college, get a real apartment, build a life of quiet anonymity far away from Oakhaven and the ghosts of the Sterling Foundry. It was the ultimate survivor's move. But another part of me, a part I barely knew existed, was whispering something else. My grandfather hadn't just left me money. He had left me a choice, a test. He had used dirty money to try and save his business, and it had destroyed him. Now he was giving me the chance to use it for something else. To redeem it, maybe. To redeem him. To fight. Fighting felt insane. I was an 18-year-old kid with no resources, no connections, and no skills. My enemy was a wealthy development company with lawyers and influence, the modern incarnation of the same criminal enterprise that had broken my grandfather. What could I possibly do? I'd pay the taxes, and then what? They would just find another way to take the property. They'd use regulations, zoning laws, or simple intimidation. I would be a temporary roadblock, nothing more. The sun rose, casting long, dusty fingers of light through the grimy office windows. The foundry floor below was slowly illuminated, the sleeping machines taking on shape and form. I looked out at the vast, silent space. It wasn't just a pile of rust. It was the last piece of him. It was the scene of his crime and the monument to his sacrifice. Selling it to them, letting them tear it down, felt like letting them win. It felt like spitting on his grave. I thought about the town, Oakhaven, dying on its feet. I thought about the tired woman at the gas station, her quiet recognition. This foundry hadn't just been my grandfather's life. It had been the life of this town. Its closure had left a wound that had never healed. The choice wasn't just about me versus them. It was about what this place could be. It was about honoring the past by building a future. I made my decision. It felt like jumping off a cliff. I packed the $60,000 into my worn backpack, leaving the empty box under the floorboard. I took the letters and the tapes, and I walked out of the foundry, the morning sun on my face. The walk to the town hall felt different. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. I wasn't an intruder anymore. I was a Sterling. This was my town. The county clerk's office was a small, cluttered room that smelled of coffee and old paper. A woman with a formidable beehive hairdo and glasses on a chain looked up at me, her expression a mixture of boredom and suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to pay the back taxes on the Sterling Foundry property," I said. My voice was steady, much steadier than I felt. She blinked. "The Sterling property? Honey, that's over $50,000. "I know," I said. I unzipped my backpack and began pulling out the bundles of $100 bills, placing them carefully on the counter. The clerk's eyes widened, her jaw went slack. The entire office fell silent. The only sound was the soft thud of cash hitting the worn linoleum counter. As she was staring, dumbfounded, the door to the office opened. A man in an expensive suit walked in. He was in his late 40s, with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Marjorie," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I just came to check on the foreclosure paperwork for the old foundry." He noticed me then and the piles of cash on the counter. His smile tightened. "Well, What have we here? The clerk, Marjorie, found her voice. Mr. Croft, she said, her voice trembling slightly. This young man he's paying the taxes. Croft's eyes locked onto mine. There was no surprise in them, just a flicker of annoyance, like a man swatting a fly. Is that so? He said, turning his full attention to me. You must be the heir. Leo, is it? I'm James Croft. My company has been trying to acquire that property. To be frank, we're doing the town a favor. It's a worthless, dangerous eyesore. It's my property, I said, meeting his gaze. And it's not for sale. He let out a low chuckle. Kid, you have no idea what you're getting into. Paying the taxes is one thing. The place is a toxic waste dump. It'll cost a fortune to bring it up to code. You'll be bankrupt in a month. I'm offering you a clean way out. My original offer still stands. $5,000, a gesture of goodwill. He slid a business card across the counter. Think it over. When you come to your senses, give me a call. He turned and walked out, the door clicking softly shut behind him. He didn't need to threaten me. The threat was implied in his casual confidence, in the way he said my name. He was the snake in the garden, and I had just announced my intention to stay. Marjorie, the clerk, finally snapped out of her stupor. She began counting the money, her hands shaking at first, then moving with a practiced efficiency. It took a long time. When she was done, she looked at me, a new expression on her face. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was something like respect. It's all here, she said, almost in a whisper. She stamped a thick pile of papers with a heavy, satisfying thud. Paid in full. The lien is lifted. The sterling foundry is yours, free and clear. She handed me the receipt, a simple piece of paper that felt like the heaviest thing I had ever held. It was my declaration of war. I walked out of the town hall into the bright sunshine, $10,000 lighter in my backpack, but 100 times heavier with purpose. I had made my choice. I was staying. I was going to fight. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was building. The news that someone had paid the taxes on the old foundry spread through Oak Haven like wildfire. In a town where nothing ever happened, it was front-page news, if the town had a front page. My first stop was the diner. I was starving, and I needed to think. I sat in a booth by the window, the receipt from the town hall on the table next to my salt shaker. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, came over. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please," I said, "and whatever's good." She brought me a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and hash browns. It was the best meal I'd ever had. As I ate, I noticed people glancing at me. A couple of old men sitting at the counter were whispering, nodding in my direction. I felt exposed, a specimen under a microscope. After a few minutes, one of the men got up and walked over to my booth. He was old, with hands gnarled and stained with a lifetime of grease. He wore a mechanic's uniform with the name Gus stitched over the pocket. "You're Arthur Sterling's grandson," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," I said. He nodded slowly, his eyes appraising me. "I worked for your granddad for 20 years. He was a good man, a bit proud, but his heart was in the right place." He looked out the window in the direction of the foundry. "Heard you paid the taxes. Heard you told Jimmy Croft to take a hike." "Something like that," I said. Gus let out a wheezing laugh. "Good for you, kid. It's about time someone stood up to those vultures." He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping. "Be careful, though. The Crofts have long memories and deep pockets. They don't like being told no." He straightened up and clapped me on the shoulder. "If you need a hand out at the old place, getting the power back on, checking the generators, you come find me at the garage. First consultation's free." He walked back to the counter, leaving me stunned. It was the first offer of help I had ever received in my life that didn't come with a form to fill out. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. It was the first thread of connection to this place, to these people. I spent the next few days at the Foundry, armed with a broom, a shovel, and a growing sense of the impossible scale of the task ahead. The first thing I did was clean my grandfather's office. I scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and wiped down every surface until the grime of 14 years was gone. I set up a small camp for myself in the corner, with a sleeping bag and a camping stove I bought at the town's hardware store. It was my home base, my fortress. Then I started on the main floor. The dust was ankle-deep in some places. I swept for hours, the air becoming a thick, choking cloud. I shoveled out piles of debris and animal nests. I pulled the tarps off the machinery. The hulking metal beasts underneath were in surprisingly good condition, protected from the worst of the elements. They were coated in a layer of cosmoline, a thick, greasy preservative. My grandfather had prepared this place for a long sleep. The work was backbreaking, monotonous, and lonely. But with every shovelful of dirt, with every square foot of floor I reclaimed from the decay, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. I was sweating out the passivity of my institutionalized childhood and building a new kind of strength. I was earning my place here. A week into the cleanup, Gus the mechanic showed up, true to his word. He spent a whole afternoon with me, tracing power lines, inspecting the massive diesel generator that was meant to be the Foundry's backup power. "The bones are good," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Arthur built this place to last. We can get this old girl humming again. It'll take some work, but it's possible." He showed me how to service the generator, how to check the fluids, how to safely connect it to the Foundry's main breaker. That evening, for the first time in 14 years, lights flickered on inside the Sterling Foundry. It was just a few bare bulbs hanging from the high ceiling, but they pushed back the oppressive darkness, transforming the space from a tomb into a workshop. Gus and I stood there in the middle of the vast floor, bathed in the warm yellow light, and I felt a surge of hope so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. The light attracted attention. More people from the town started to drift by. The waitress from the diner, whose name was Sarah, brought me a hot casserole one evening, telling me I was too skinny. A retired high school shop teacher named Mr. Henderson stopped in and spent hours identifying the old machines for me, explaining what they did, his eyes lighting up with a passion he hadn't felt in years. I was no longer just an outsider. I was becoming part of the town's story, a strange new chapter that nobody had expected. I learned more about the Crofts. James Croft, the son, had rebranded the family business. They weren't back-alley thugs anymore. They were a legitimate development corporation. But they operated the same way, using financial pressure and legal loopholes to squeeze people out, buying up Oakhaven piece by piece. My Foundry was a prime piece of riverfront real estate, the cornerstone of their plan to build luxury condos. My defiance was more than an annoyance. It was a genuine threat to their bottom line. They started to push back. A building inspector showed up, a nervous man who couldn't meet my eye, and handed me a list of 100 different code violations, each with a hefty fine attached. A lawyer sent me a cease and desist letter, claiming the noise from my generator was a public nuisance, even though my nearest neighbor was a mile away. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, designed to bleed me dry and break my spirit. I was overwhelmed. The small amount of money I had left was dwindling fast. The hopeful energy I'd felt began to curdle into despair. I was alone again, outmatched and out of my depth. One night, sitting in the office, surrounded by violation notices and threatening letters, I almost gave up. I pulled out James Croft's business card. The $5,000 seemed like a paradise. I could just call him, sign the papers, and all this would be over. I could walk away. As my finger hovered over the numbers on my phone, my eyes fell on the small cassette player sitting on the desk. I picked it up, and on a whim, I pressed play on the last tape again, listening to the end of my grandfather's final message. Live a good life, Leo. Be a better man than I was. His voice, full of pain and love, was a lifeline. He hadn't given up, not even when it cost him everything. How could I? I put the phone down. The fight wasn't over. I just needed a new plan. I wasn't going to restart a foundry. The world didn't need one. But maybe, just maybe, Oak Haven needed what this place could become. The idea came to me not in a flash of inspiration, but in a slow dawn of understanding. It came from the stories the townspeople told me. Gus talked about how he wished he had a space to teach young kids about auto repair, a place to pass on his skills. Mr. Henderson, the shop teacher, lamented that the high school had shut down its wood and metal shops due to budget cuts. Sarah, the diner waitress, dreamed of a community kitchen where people could start small food businesses. They all saw the same problem. Oak Haven was full of people with skills and ambition, but there was no place for them to use them. The town's heart had been ripped out when the foundry closed, and nothing had ever replaced it. My grandfather's foundry wasn't just a building, it was an infrastructure. It had power, space, and history. I couldn't make it a foundry again, but I could make it a place where people could build things. Small things, new things, their own things. I decided to turn the Sterling Foundry into a community workshop, a shared space for makers and artisans. A place where Gus could teach kids, where Mr. Henderson could set up a wood shop, where Sarah's aspiring bakers could use a commercial-grade oven. I called it the Oak Haven Forge. Not a place for forging steel, but for forging futures. It was a crazy, idealistic dream, born of desperation. To make it happen, I needed the town's support, and I needed to fight the Crofts in a way they wouldn't expect. I started with the code violations. Instead of trying to fight them one by one, I went to the next town meeting. It was a sad affair, held in the high school gymnasium with maybe 30 people in attendance. The town council sat at a folding table at the front, looking defeated. James Croft was there, sitting in the front row, looking smug. When it was time for public comment, I walked to the microphone. My hands were sweating. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I had never spoken in public before. "My name is Leo Sterling," I said, my voice shaking. "My grandfather, Arthur Sterling, built the foundry that for 50 years was the heart of this town. Now, I'm trying to bring it back to life, not as a factory, but as a community space, a place for all of us." I laid out my vision for the Oak Haven Forge. I talked about shared workshops, about classes for kids, about creating a place where new small businesses could be born. I could feel the energy in the room shift. People were leaning forward, listening. Then I turned to the problem of the violations. Mr. Croft's development company has been using the town's own regulations to try and shut this project down before it even starts, I said, looking directly at him. His smile faltered. But these codes are meant to keep people safe, not to be used as weapons. So I'm asking for your help. I'm proposing a community cleanup and repair day at the Foundry. We can work together to bring the building up to code, not with money, but with our own 2 hands. There was a murmur in the crowd. I had turned their attack into a call for unity. I had made the Foundry's problem into the town's project. James Croft stood up. "This is absurd," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The boy is an idealist with no idea how the real world works. That building is a liability. My plan for condos will bring new tax revenue, new life to this town." Gus stood up from the back of the room. "Your plan will bring a bunch of rich weekenders who'll drive up property taxes and push the rest of us out, Jimmy," he called out. "I'd rather have a place for our kids to learn a trade." Sarah, the waitress, stood up. "I'd rather have a place to start my own bakery." One by one, others stood up, their voices joining a chorus of support. The town council, seeing the tide turn, agreed to put a temporary hold on the fines, pending the outcome of the community workday. Croft stormed out of the meeting, his mask of civility gone. I had won the battle, but I knew the war was far from over. The workday was more successful than I could have ever dreamed. Over 50 people showed up. Gus and his friends rewired half the building. Mr. Henderson and a crew of volunteers repaired the broken windows and patched the roof. A team of women, led by Sarah, scrubbed the cavernous interior from top to bottom. It was a festival of rebuilding. The sound of hammers, saws, and laughter filled the old foundry, chasing away the ghosts of silence and decay. In one day, we accomplished more than I could have in a year. We didn't fix everything, but we made a start. We showed the Crofts and ourselves what this community was capable of. The Oakhaven Forge was no longer just my dream, it was ours. We began to build. We used salvaged materials and donated equipment. The old metal lathes were cleaned and restored. A section of the floor was converted into a pristine wood shop. We built a small, certified kitchen in what used to be the foreman's locker room. Every day, the Foundry became less of a relic and more of a living, breathing place. I lived and worked there, fueled by coffee and the incredible energy of the people around me. I learned how to weld from a retired shipbuilder. I learned basic carpentry from Mr. Henderson. I learned that community wasn't just a word, it was a verb. It was something you built together, one 2x4, one shared meal, one act of trust at a time. The Crofts didn't give up. They filed lawsuits. They tried to buy out our suppliers. They spread rumors that the forge was unsafe, a haven for delinquents. But they had miscalculated. Their attacks didn't divide us. They brought us closer together. We were the underdogs, and it gave us a powerful sense of shared identity. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that truly saved us, came from my grandfather's letters. Tucked into the back of the envelope, I found a smaller, sealed packet I had overlooked. Inside were copies of the documents he had collected all those years ago. Shipping manifests, bank transfers, names, all detailing Silas Croft's illegal operations at the Foundry. He had given the originals to the feds, but he had kept a copy, his insurance policy. I took it to the only person I thought I could trust, a young, ambitious reporter for the regional newspaper who had written a small, sympathetic article about our project. He spent a month verifying the information. The story, when it broke, was an explosion. It connected James Croft's legitimate company to its criminal roots, exposing a pattern of intimidation and corruption that stretched back decades. The federal investigation was reopened. The condo project collapsed under the weight of the scandal. James Croft was ruined, not by a frontal assault, but by the quiet, patient truth my grandfather had recorded so long ago. His legacy had reached out from the past and given us our future. The day the newspaper story broke, I stood on the catwalk overlooking the main floor of the Oakhaven Forge. Below me, the huge space was alive with activity. In the woodshop, a young woman was putting the finishing touches on a beautiful handmade chair. In the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread filled the air. In the mechanics corner, Gus was showing a group of teenagers how to change the oil in an old pickup truck. Light streamed in through the clean windows, illuminating the dust motes that still danced in the air. But they weren't ghosts anymore. They were just dust. The Foundry was breathing again. Its new lungs were filled with the air of creation and community. We had done it. We had built something new from the wreckage. My grandfather had left me a pile of rust and a terrible choice. He had asked me to be a better man than he was. I looked at the scene below me, at the life and hope filling this old building, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, I was on my way. I never became a master craftsman. I was a terrible welder and a mediocre carpenter. My role here was different. I was the keeper of the story, the one who had turned the key and let the light in. I managed the space, scheduled the workshops, and made sure everyone had what they needed to build their dreams. It was a different kind of building. Home, I realized, isn't a place you inherit. It's a choice you make every day. It's the community you build, the purpose you find, the story you decide to live out. My inheritance wasn't the deed to a piece of land. It was the chance to reclaim a name, to honor a sacrifice, and to turn a place of secrets and pain into a place of hope and creation. I often think about my grandfather, Arthur Sterling. I think about the terrible weight he carried, the impossible choice he made in the dark, all for a grandson he would never see grow up. He thought he had failed, that his legacy was one of mistakes and compromises. But he was wrong. His legacy wasn't the Foundry he lost. It was the choice he gave me. He gave me the chance to build, and in doing so, to rebuild, not just a building, but a town and myself. What he started in desperation, we finished with purpose. What he sealed in fear, we opened with hope. The iron and steel of this place were forged in fire, and in a way, so were we. We were all Sterling and Son. Or Sterling and sons and daughters, I guess. A new kind of family, forged not from blood, but from a shared belief that everyone deserves a second chance, and a place to build it. My grandfather didn't leave me a foundry. He left me a key. A key to a building, yes, but also a key to the past, and a key to a future he could never have imagined. And the most important thing I've learned is that what you build with a key like that matters more than any inheritance you could ever be given. It matters more than anything. And that's the story of how a lost kid found a home in a pile of rust. Maybe you're standing on a threshold of your own right now. Maybe you've been handed a legacy that feels more like a burden than a gift. The lesson I learned in that cold, dusty foundry is that the past doesn't have to be a prison. Sometimes it's a foundation. You just have to be brave enough to build on it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to build a life for yourself out of scraps and hope, then I hope you'll join our community here. Hit that subscribe button, because we tell stories for people who know that the best things in life aren't given, they're built. And I want you to do me a favor. In the comments below, I want you to share one thing you're proud of building in your own life. It doesn't have to be a building. It could be a relationship, a skill, a family, a moment of courage. I'll be reading every single one, because every story of rebuilding matters. Thank you for listening. Now go out there and build something beautiful.